The rain hammered softly against the diner windows as an old man in a faded veteran's cap lifted his trembling coffee cup. 81 years old, scars on his hands, stories etched in silence. Then the door slammed. A thug swaggered in, loud, cruel, mocking the man who had once carried a nation on his back, and with a shocking crack, he slapped him across the face. Forks froze midair, the diner went silent. No one knew that in just moments, his son would walk in with the Hell's Angels. The rain pattered softly against the glass windows of a small-town diner, the kind of place where the scent of bacon and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Inside, the warm light glowed against chrome stools and faded photographs on the walls. At a corner booth sat an elderly man, 81 years old, silver hair neatly combed, a faded veteran's cap resting proudly on his head. His hands trembled as he lifted his coffee, not from weakness alone, but from a lifetime of battles that still echoed in his bones. To the regulars, he was a quiet figure of dignity. Few knew the full weight of his story. Then the door banged open. A young thug swaggered in, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. His voice cut through the diner like a blade, loud, brash, dripping with arrogance. He scanned the room, looking for attention, and his eyes landed on the old veteran. A cruel smirk twisted across his face. He strutted toward the table. "What's the matter, old man? Too slow to lift that cup? Too old to fight for yourself anymore?" His words, sharp and mocking, drew uncomfortable glances from the other diners. The waitress froze, clutching her notepad, unsure whether to intervene. The veteran didn't respond. He simply lowered his gaze, his jaw tight, his silence more powerful than words. But the thug wasn't satisfied. His pride demanded a spectacle. He leaned in closer, taunting, until suddenly, "Slap!" The sound cracked through the room. The veteran's head snapped to the side, his cap tumbling to the floor. Forks clattered against plates, conversations died mid-sentence, and an eerie silence blanketed the diner. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. For a moment, the old man sat still, breathing heavily, his eyes glistening. Not from fear, but from memories of battles fought, of brothers lost, of sacrifices made that this arrogant stranger could never understand. The thug grinned, satisfied with his cruelty. But what he didn't know was that this single act of disrespect would awaken something far greater than his own ego. Because in just a few minutes, the diner door would open again, and with it would come the storm. A storm carrying leather, engines, and the fury of men who lived by a code. And at the center of it would be the veteran's son. Long before he was the quiet man in the corner booth, he had been a soldier. Not the kind who bragged about battles or boasted about medals, but the kind who carried the weight of war in silence. In his youth, his hands had been steady, his back unbent, his eyes sharp with purpose. He had walked into the service as a boy and walked out a man who had seen too much. He fought on foreign soil where the sky thundered with explosions, where the earth shook with every step, and where he learned that freedom was never free. He had lost friends whose names he whispered in his prayers even now, 81 years later. The medals tucked away in a wooden box at home were not symbols of pride, but reminders of sacrifices made, his and others. When the war ended, he didn't come home a hero in parades. He came home quietly, stepping off a bus with nothing but a duffel bag and weary eyes. America was moving on, and he didn't ask for thanks. He wanted only to build a life, one that honored the brothers who never made it back. He found work with his hands, laying bricks, fixing engines, anything honest that kept food on the table. He met a woman, gentle, steady, and kind. She became his anchor in the storm. They married, raised a son, and carved out a simple life in a small town. There were no riches, no headlines, but there was laughter in their home, the smell of home-cooked meals, the sound of his boys' feet running down the hallway. That was enough. Years rolled by. His son grew, found his own path, a path not without shadows, but one carved with fierce loyalty and fire. The veteran's wife, his partner through decades of trials, grew ill. He sat by her hospital bed night after night, holding her hand as the machines hummed until the day she slipped away. He never remarried. Some wounds, like some wars, never fully heal. Now the diner had become his sanctuary. Every week, without fail, he came to the same corner booth. He would order the same black coffee, sometimes a slice of pie, and sit quietly watching life move around him. To the regulars, he was part of the diner itself, like the old jukebox or the worn leather stools. Few stopped to ask his story, but they nodded respectfully, sensing there was more behind his quiet presence. And in that silence, he carried the memories, the laughter of his late wife, the echo of his son's first words, the haunting cries of soldiers left on battlefields oceans away. He bore it all with the same stoicism that had defined him since youth. He never complained, never demanded recognition. His dignity was his armor, his humility his weapon. That's why the moment mattered. That's why the slap stung deeper than just skin. It wasn't just an act of cruelty against an old man. It was an insult to decades of sacrifice, to a life built on discipline, loss, and love. The man sitting in that diner wasn't just a frail veteran with trembling hands. He was living history. He was proof of resilience, of honor, of courage. And when that thug's palm struck his cheek, it struck every scar, every memory, every sacrifice he had ever endured. And yet, even in that moment, he remained still. Not out of weakness, but out of the same unspoken strength that had carried him through war, through loss, through life itself. This was a man worth rooting for. And soon, the world inside that diner would realize it. The door hadn't been closed for more than a second before the atmosphere shifted. The thug's presence was like a storm cloud rolling into a clear sky, loud, brash, impossible to ignore. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with restless eyes that darted around the diner, searching for attention. His leather jacket was scuffed, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and his voice carried the sneering confidence of someone who mistook fear for respect. He was the kind of man who barked orders in a room just to see who would flinch. His crew followed him in, a few rough-looking boys whose laughter seemed forced, as if they laughed not because the jokes were funny, but because silence would cost them his approval. They took a booth, loud and disruptive, but the thug himself had his eyes locked on the veteran in the corner. There he was, the old man, hands trembling slightly as he lifted his fork. To the thug, he wasn't a figure of honor. He wasn't a man who had carried a nation on his back. To him, the veteran was just an easy target. The thug strolled over, swaggering with false bravado, and leaned against the edge of the veteran's table. "Hey, Grandpa," he jeered, voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna finish that food before you keel over, or do you need someone to cut it up for you?" The veteran didn't answer. His silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. But the thug mistook it as an invitation to push further. "Look at you," he continued, his grin widening, "still playing dress-up with that little army cap. What's that supposed to mean? You think anyone cares about what you did 50 years ago? This is the real world now. Nobody's clapping for you anymore." His words sliced through the diner, drawing uncomfortable glances. The waitress froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene. A trucker at the counter clenched his jaw but stayed seated. No one wanted to escalate the situation. The thug's friends chuckled nervously, their laughter ringing hollow. One of them muttered, "Come on, man, leave him alone." But the thug waved him off, emboldened by the attention. "What are you even doing here, old man?" he spat, leaning in closer. "Shouldn't you be in a nursing home somewhere drooling on yourself? People like you had your time. This world belongs to us now." Still, the veteran didn't move. He sat with quiet dignity, his eyes fixed on his plate, his silence louder than any retort. The thug's smile faltered for just a second, as though the calm resistance unsettled him. But then his ego demanded more. He had to prove dominance. He had to break the silence. So he did the unthinkable. He lifted his hand, and with a sharp, echoing crack, he slapped the veteran across the face. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Forks clattered against plates. The jukebox in the corner hummed on, but no one dared breathe. The veteran's cap tumbled to the floor, landing at the thug's boots. For a moment, the entire diner froze. The old man sat motionless, eyes closed, jaw tight. His cheek reddened from the blow, but he did not rise, did not react. He carried himself with the same stillness he had learned in foxholes, waiting out mortar fire, refusing to give the enemy the satisfaction of breaking. The thug straightened, grinning as if he had won. His friends laughed again, louder this time, but the sound was brittle, forced. Even they knew the line had been crossed. Around the room, eyes darted nervously. The waitress clutched her notepad so tightly it crumpled in her hand. The trucker's fists were balled on the counter, his knuckles white, but still he didn't move. A mother shielded her child's eyes. Silence pressed against the walls. The slap wasn't just an insult to one man. It was an insult to everything he had lived for, everything he had endured. And deep down, the thug had no idea what storm he had just invited into that room. Because soon, that diner door would open again. And this time, it wouldn't be a boy swaggering in with false bravado. It would be men who lived by a code, and a son who had just seen the mark on his father's face. The sound of the slap still lingered in the air, vibrating against the walls like an echo no one wanted to claim. The diner, usually alive with chatter and the clink of dishes, fell into an unnatural stillness. The waitress stood near the counter, notepad trembling in her hand. Her eyes darted between the veteran and the thug, her instincts screaming to intervene, yet her body frozen by fear. She wanted to speak up, to tell the man to leave, but what if he turned on her? What if he made her the next target? Her lips parted, then closed again. She stayed silent. At the far end, a trucker gripped his coffee mug so tightly that the veins in his forearm bulged. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, every muscle screaming to act. But he remained seated. He had seen fights before, seen them spiral into chaos, and he told himself he was choosing peace. Yet deep inside, he knew it was something else. He was afraid of escalation, of violence spilling beyond control. He lowered his gaze, ashamed. Two teenagers whispered nervously in their booth, their wide eyes fixed on the veteran's trembling hands. One of them muttered, "Shouldn't we call someone?" The other shook his head quickly. "Don't get involved, it's not our problem." They sank lower in their seats, trying to disappear. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, covering the child's eyes as though shielding her from the ugliness of the world. The little girl peeked through her fingers anyway, confused why no one was helping the man who looked like her grandpa. The thug stood tall, basking in the silence. To him, the lack of resistance was victory. He strutted back toward his booth, smirking as though he had proven his dominance over not just the old man, but the entire room. Meanwhile, the veteran slowly straightened in his seat. He reached down with trembling fingers, picked up his fallen cap and brushed it gently before placing it back on his head. His cheek burned red, but his eyes were what caught the room. They glistened not with shame, but with memories. Memories of battles where he had faced worse than this. Memories of brothers who had fallen while he lived on. Memories that reminded him that silence had its own strength. He sat back down, folded his hands on the table, and lifted his coffee once more. The cup shook, but he held it steady enough to take a sip. The room watched him, and in that moment every person wrestled with the same unspoken question: why didn't I stand up? Fear, shame, insecurity, all of it mixed into the silence that filled the diner like smoke. The narrator's voice cuts in, carrying the weight of the question outward. Cruelty thrives when good people stay silent. In that diner, every soul felt the sting of that slap, but only one man carried it on his face. What would you have done? Would you have stood up? The question hung heavy, unanswered. And then, the faint jingle of the diner's doorbell broke the silence. The storm was coming. The bell above the diner door jingled again, soft and ordinary, yet the sound rolled through the room like a drumbeat announcing something inevitable. Heads turned instinctively, every pair of eyes drawn toward the entrance. Heavy boots struck the linoleum floor, each step deliberate, measured. The rain still clung to the man's shoulders, dripping down the black leather of his jacket. His hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered by years on the road, but his posture carried the weight of quiet authority. He didn't need to speak for the room to sense it. This was not a man to be trifled with. The thug's smirk faltered for just a moment, though he quickly tried to mask it with arrogance. He had no idea who he was looking at, not yet. The man at the door scanned the diner with sharp, calculating eyes. He noticed the stillness in the air, the frozen expressions on the faces of strangers, the uncomfortable silence pressing against the walls. And then his gaze fell upon the corner booth. The veteran, his father. For a heartbeat, the son didn't move. His eyes locked on the old man's face, on the red welt that still burned across his cheek. His father's cap was tilted slightly from where it had been knocked to the ground and replaced. His trembling hands wrapped around a coffee cup, trying to steady the world that had just been shaken. Something shifted in the son's expression. A storm gathered there, quiet but unmistakable. The room felt it. The waitress stepped back against the counter, her breath caught in her throat. The trucker stiffened, sensing a change in the air. Even the thug's friends glanced at each other uneasily, though none dared to speak. The son's hand flexed slowly inside his leather glove. The squeak of tightening knuckles against worn leather sounded louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights. He wasn't a man who wasted words, but the silence around him screamed louder than any shout could have. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, the low rumble of engines echoed faintly from outside. Not just one, many. The kind of sound that made windows vibrate and hearts skip beats. The sound of a brotherhood on wheels. The thug's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. He tried to laugh it off, puffing up his chest again. "What? You here to stare at me, old man Junior? Didn't your daddy teach you manners?" But the son didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. The door swung open again, and leather-clad men filed in, their jackets emblazoned with the unmistakable insignia. The Hell's Angels. The Brotherhood. His brotherhood. The diner, already tense, sank into pin-drop silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The son's eyes never left the mark on his father's cheek. Every detail was etched into his mind. The cruel imprint of a hand that had dared to dishonor a man who had given everything for his country, for his family. His jaw tightened. His gloves creaked as his fists curled tight. The thug, still pretending at bravado, had no idea. No idea of the storm he had called down with a single act of arrogance. The room could feel it, though. Something was about to break, something inevitable. And in the center of it all stood a son, staring at the red mark on his father's cheek, vowing silently that no one would ever lay a hand on him again. The bell above the diner door still swayed from his entrance, its faint chime hanging like a warning note in the heavy silence. The son stood there, broad shoulders framed in leather, patches and road-worn fabric telling their own story of miles traveled and battles fought on different front lines. His eyes scanned the room, then locked on the single detail that turned his blood cold, the faint, reddened handprint burning across his father's wrinkled cheek. He pulled off his gloves slowly, each tug echoing louder than the clink of coffee cups or the rain outside. Diners didn't move. Even the waitress froze with her notepad dangling uselessly at her side. The only sound was the soft hum of the neon sign above the window, flickering like the pulse of the room. His voice was calm but ironclad. "Who touched my father?" The thug shifted in his seat, his smirk cracking into something less certain. He forced a laugh, trying to coat his fear with bravado. "Old man was in my way, just teaching him a little respect." His friends chuckled weakly, but their eyes betrayed them, darting nervously to the man in leather. The son took a step forward, boots striking the floor like a war drum. "Respect." His tone was low, dangerous, almost a whisper. "You think slapping an 80-year-old man who carried scars you'll never understand makes you strong." The thug puffed out his chest, desperate to hold his ground. "Relax, it was just a joke, don't get all dramatic." He leaned back in his booth, but his hands fidgeted with the straw in his drink, betraying the cracks in his armor. The son leaned closer, fists unclenched but coiled ready. His face was carved with quiet fury, not the explosive rage the thug expected, but something colder. That man bled for this country. He carried brothers out of fire. He buried friends so you could grow up in a land safe enough to mock him in a diner. The words cut through the room like a blade. Diners exchanged glances, some bowed their heads in shame. The waitress's eyes welled with tears. Even the trucker by the counter shifted in his seat, suddenly emboldened by the weight of truth filling the air. The thug swallowed hard, trying to keep his grin alive. "Man, you don't scare me. You're just some biker." The son's eyes narrowed. "No, I'm his son." He pointed a steady finger at his father, who sat silently, his dignity intact even as his hands trembled on the tabletop. "And if you raise your hand against him again, you'll answer to me." The diner seemed to hold its breath. The silence was no longer cowardice, it was anticipation. A storm was gathering, and everyone knew it. The thug leaned back further, searching for a way out when the sound of engines thundered outside. Heavy, numerous, the kind that shakes glass in its frame. The sun didn't flinch, but the thug's face drained of color. One by one, headlights beamed through the rain-streaked windows, shadows of leather-clad figures dismounting their bikes. The son smirked, not in arrogance but in certainty. Reinforcements had arrived. He leaned in close enough for only the thug to hear. "Disrespect one veteran, you disrespect us all." The bell above the door rang again. The storm had only just begun. The first rumble started low, like distant thunder rolling across the highway. Heads turned toward the rain-streaked windows. The sound multiplied, one engine, then 5, then a dozen more, melding into a chorus that shook the very bones of the diner. Coffee cups trembled in their saucers. The neon sign flickered against the glass, caught in the vibration. Even the ceiling lights buzzed as though the storm outside had found its way in. The thug's grin faltered. He craned his neck toward the window, eyes narrowing as a convoy of headlights cut through the night. Shadows of broad frames swung off gleaming chrome. The ground itself seemed to pulse beneath the steady beat of boots hitting wet pavement. Inside, silence thickened. Every diner sat frozen, every breath shallow, as if waiting for a verdict to be read. The old veteran lifted his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. A spark of recognition flickered there, not of fear, but of memory. This sound, this unity, reminded him of marching columns long ago. The bell over the door chimed, then again, and again. One by one, the Hell's Angels entered, the storm breaking through the threshold in human form. Leather jackets, patched vests, rain glistening off helmets. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Presence alone filled the room, pressing against the walls until even the air felt heavier. Dozens of eyes scanned the diner, then landed on the veteran. They paused, respectful nods exchanged, acknowledging the red mark on his cheek like a silent wound carved into all of them. Then their gaze shifted to the thug. Slow motion seemed to take over. Boots spread wide, hands resting casually at their sides, the angels moved closer, not charging, not striking, just surrounding. A circle closed around the thug's booth, leather brushing leather, their unity suffocating in its quiet. The young man's friends shrank back, slipping toward the wall, their laughter gone. The thug tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked halfway. This is ridiculous. It was just a slap. You guys are overreacting." No one answered. Silence was the weapon now, silence and the weight of numbers. The son stepped forward, eyes locked on the man who had dared touch his father. His voice was steady, louder now, echoing in the stillness. "This isn't about overreacting. This is about respect. You thought you could humiliate a man who gave you the freedom to sit here and mock him, but here's the truth. He's not alone." The biker closest to the veteran gently set a hand on the old man's shoulder. It wasn't a show of aggression, it was reverence. The kind of gesture that said, "Your battles are ours now. Your scars are our inheritance." The veteran's trembling hand steadied against his coffee cup. For the first time all evening, his shoulders lifted with dignity restored. The thug's eyes darted around the circle. Every exit blocked, every excuse evaporated. He realized now this wasn't about fists. If one of them had thrown a punch, he might have fought back or at least pretended to. But this quiet unity, this suffocating presence, it stripped him bare, left him small. Finally, the son leaned in close, voice like gravel. Take a good look around you. This is power, not the cheap kind you get from hurting someone weaker. Real power is standing shoulder to shoulder, protecting those who deserve honor. Remember that before you ever raise your hand again. The thug swallowed hard, his bravado drained. For the first time, his hands shook, not the veterans. And the room knew the fight was already over. The circle of leather and silence pressed in tighter, invisible walls closing on the thug. His chest rose and fell too fast, each breath more jagged than the last. His earlier swagger had evaporated, replaced by the wide-eyed look of a man cornered not by fists, but by something far heavier: conscience, respect, and shame. The veteran's son didn't flinch. His voice cut through the thick air like steel. You're going to make this right, now. The thug tried to scoff, but his throat caught. His words stumbled. What do you want me to do? It was just... The son stepped forward until they were only inches apart, the red mark on his father's cheek still burning in the periphery of everyone's gaze. His tone was deadly calm. You will apologize to my father, here, now, in front of everyone. The diner held its breath. Even the rain outside seemed to pause against the glass. The thug's friends shrank further back, offering no rescue. He was alone now, all his bravado stripped away. His lips trembled, defiance flickering one last time before it crumbled. I'm sorry. The words came out weak, barely audible. The son's jaw clenched, louder. The thug swallowed, sweat running down his temple. He turned to face the veteran fully, eyes downcast. I'm sorry for what I did. I was wrong. Every diner leaned in. The moment was bigger than an apology. It was a public surrender of arrogance, the collapse of false pride. The veteran, still seated, raised his tired eyes. His cheek was still red, his hand still trembling slightly, but his voice, steady, low, unshakably firm, cut the silence like a blade. I fought for your right to stand free, he said, his tone carrying decades of battles, losses, and victories. Don't waste it by standing small. The words struck deeper than any fist could. The thug flinched as if pierced by something far sharper than fear. The diners, silent until now, let out a collective exhale. Shoulders dropped, tension released. It was as if the entire room had been holding its breath, waiting for dignity to win. The thug's face burned crimson. With nothing left to say, he stumbled backward, breaking through the circle. The leather wall of angels parted just enough to let him pass. Deliberately, slowly, forcing him to feel every gaze, every judgment, every ounce of the weight he had earned. He pushed through the door, its bell jangling pathetically behind him, and disappeared into the rainy night. His footsteps splashed against the pavement, retreat echoing against the rumble of the bikes still outside. Inside, silence lingered for one more heavy beat. Then, like the release of a storm, the room breathed again. Forks tapped nervously, a chair creaked, someone whispered, "Finally." But the center of it all was still the veteran, sitting with his coffee, back straightened, dignity restored. And the crowd knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Arrogance humbled, respect reclaimed. For a long moment, the diner sat in hushed stillness, as if the echoes of what had just happened still clung to the walls. The veteran adjusted his cap, fingers brushing the brim with quiet dignity. His son stood just behind him, a silent sentinel, one hand resting gently on the back of his father's chair. Then it began, hesitant at first. The waitress, who earlier had frozen with fear, stepped forward. Her eyes glistened as she set a steaming plate in front of the old man. "This one's on the house, sir," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Her hand lingered on his shoulder a moment longer before she retreated, wiping at her eyes with the corner of her apron. A trucker, the same man who had clenched his fists earlier but hadn't dared intervene, rose slowly from his booth. He walked over, boots heavy on the tiled floor, and stopped at the veteran's table. His voice was gravelly but sincere. "I should have stood up sooner, but you, sir, you stood up a long time ago for all of us. I won't forget that." He lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a soldier's salute. The gesture was awkward but heartfelt. The veteran returned it with a faint nod, the corners of his lips tugging upward. Then came a softer sound, a child's footsteps. A little girl no older than 7 shuffled out from behind her mother's legs. In her tiny hands, she clutched a crayon drawing she had been scribbling earlier. She held it out shyly, a stick figure in a cap standing beneath a flag. "This is you," she said, voice trembling. Before the old man could answer, she wrapped her arms around him. His breath caught, the sting in his eyes no longer from humiliation but from gratitude. Slowly, he patted her back, his weathered hand engulfing her small frame. The dam broke. One by one, diners rose from their seats. A businessman in a suit shook the veteran's hand firmly. A mother whispered a tearful "thank you." Even the nervous teenagers who had giggled earlier at the thug's jokes approached with lowered eyes, murmuring apologies for staying silent. What had been a room of bystanders now became a chorus of gratitude. The veteran sat straighter, each handshake, each word, each gesture of appreciation building him back up, piece by piece. He wasn't just an old man in a diner anymore. In this moment, he was the living embodiment of sacrifice and strength. His son placed a protective hand on his father's shoulder, his expression softening from fury to pride. The leather-clad angels stood respectfully in the background, silent guardians, as if ensuring the veteran's honor would never again be questioned. For the first time that night, the old man smiled, not faintly, not weakly, but fully. It was the smile of a man reminded that his service, his sacrifices, his lonely battles had not been forgotten. And the diner, once frozen in fear, now pulsed with something far stronger: unity, gratitude, and respect. The diner returned to its quiet hum, plates clinking and coffee steaming once more, but something in the air had shifted forever. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, soft streaks of light glistening against the windows, as though the storm itself had bowed in reverence. The veteran, his shoulders now steadied by gratitude and the presence of his son, stood slowly from his chair. The crowd parted as he rose. Some placed hands over their hearts, others whispered blessings, but no one looked away. The old man's trembling steps seemed lighter now, guided by decades of sacrifice and the fresh reminder that those sacrifices still mattered. The narrator's voice filled the silence, weaving reflection into the scene like a steady heartbeat. Cruelty thrives when good people stay silent. Tonight, silence nearly won, but courage, dignity, and unity carried the day. Remember this: standing by in fear allows arrogance to grow. Standing together in respect cuts it down. The veteran adjusted his faded cap as his son draped an arm protectively over his shoulder. Behind them, the leather-clad angels fell into quiet formation. Their engines roared to life outside, a symphony of thunder, not of destruction, but of protection. The rumble vibrated through the diner floor like a promise carved into stone: you do not stand alone. The narrator continued, voice deep with conviction. Respect is not earned by fists. Respect is not taken through cruelty. True respect is given to those who sacrificed, who carried burdens so others could live free. And true strength, it is never measured by how many fear you, but by how many you lift when they cannot stand. The camera of the imagination lingers on the faces in the diner. The waitress still wiping tears, the trucker still saluting in silence, the child clutching her crayon drawing against her chest. These were not just witnesses. They had been transformed, awakened. They had seen what happens when arrogance is confronted by honor, when cruelty is answered not with blind rage, but with unshakable unity. The veteran paused at the doorway, the neon glow framing him in red and gold. He turned one last time to the room, a faint smile breaking across his face. It wasn't just gratitude, it was hope. Hope that his battles had not been forgotten. Hope that the generations behind him might yet carry respect forward. His son opened the door, the night air washing over them. Together, father and son stepped out into the rain-slick street, the angels flanking them on either side. Engines growled in unison, headlights piercing the darkness like watchful eyes. The old man climbed onto the back of his son's bike, his hands steady now, his face lifted to the cool wind. The narrator's voice softened, but carried more weight than ever. So when you see an elder, a veteran, a figure who carries scars you cannot see, do not look away. Do not stay silent. Honor them. Protect them. Remind them they are not forgotten. Because one day it may be you in that seat, waiting to know if the world still remembers what you gave. The convoy of bikes rolled forward, a wall of thunder that shielded the frail and exalted the honorable. The diner's neon sign flickered above the door one last time, then faded into the glow of the night. And in that glow, for the first time in many years, the old veteran smiled. A smile not of loneliness, but of belonging. Cruelty fades when good people choose to stand tall. Respect is not claimed by force, but by sacrifice, character, and the courage to protect the vulnerable. Tonight, an old soldier was reminded he is never alone, and neither are we. Honor those who came before you. And if this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and be the voice that keeps respect alive.